Who? When? Where? How? And why? Understanding our past helps us see patterns that might otherwise be invisible in the present. Welcome to History Reports channel.
The desert sun blazed down out of a clear sky, burning the earth and shriveling anything that managed to grow in the scanty spring rains. From the southwestern deserts, hot winds stirred dust and sand that would whirl through the air for many days at a time. There were no trees or a forest where one could seek shelter from the flaring heat. With the exception of two slow-moving rivers that flowed southward, it seemed that there was barely anything else that brought hope to this grim scenery. The rivers attracted birds and humans, especially in the areas where the soil was damp. People managed to cultivate small plots of lands and raised livestock, mostly cows and pigs, which grazed in the marshlands. This valley that existed about 9,000 years ago was formed by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Located close to 1,000 kilometers east from the Mediterranean, deep in the Middle East, the area appeared hopeless and nearly impossible to sustain long-term life. Yet, by 3000 BC, there was an astoundingly different scenery. Along the extent of the valley, splendid cities stretched out on the riverbanks. The fertile fields of grain encircled them, along with many date palms that were virtually everywhere, now offering shade and fruit. Massive walls encircled the cities, and within them, there were streets, large brick homes, and palaces. But temples towered over nearly everything. People filled the streets and marketplaces, as hundreds of shops stretched out along the avenues, where artisans displayed their goods, from pottery to fine jewelry. What took place here was the most pivotal event in the history of mankind: the birth of civilization. The Greeks would later call this area Mesopotamia, which literally means between the rivers. And the people of this region would be known as the Sumerians, and their land as Sumer. At the time when the Sumerian civilization was rising, nearly the rest of the Earth's population were still living as nomads, and surviving by roaming in small groups, gathering seeds of wild plants and hunting. From Americas and Australia to the wide savannas of Africa and wild forests of Europe, people clothed themselves in the skins of animals and lived in caves. Only a few who broke away from this strategy of survival were some inhabitants of the Middle East. Over several millenniums, they learned to domesticate sheep and goats, and to cultivate crops of wheat and barley. At this point, they could settle in one place and no longer needed to roam. As early as 8500 BC, these people became the first farmers who established their agricultural communities to the north and east of Mesopotamia, in hilly regions where rain was plentiful. As the practice of agriculture spread fast, farmers soon designed irrigation methods that allowed them to grow crops in the region without rain. In turn, irrigated crops could sustain large settlements, which eventually grew into the first Sumerian cities on the Mesopotamian plain. In the desert near the north end of the Dead Sea, the famous biblical city of Jericho flourished here around the 7000 BC, and it was a center salt trade. Water that was rerouted from the spring nourished the fields. Over 800 kilometers in Asia Minor, irrigated crops sustained life in Shattel-Hayuk, where a settlement rose around 65 BC, near the area where a dark volcanic glass was valued for making mirrors, knives, and jewelry. However, both Jericho and Shattel-Hayuk could not sustain a large population beyond several thousand people, or expand further as they lacked agricultural resources and depended only on a single prized commodity. On the other hand, the Sumerians had access to two rivers, and were the ones who advanced irrigated agriculture on a truly grand scale. They cultivated vast stretches of sandy lands by tapping the waters of their rivers, particularly Euphrates. As they mastered the technique of irrigation, this resulted in surplus of grain, far beyond day-to-day needs of the farmers. This surplus enabled the people of Sumer the time to develop new skills and new ways of making a living. In turn, artisans, merchants, traders, and priests came into being. Moreover, a system of government emerged, as well as an organized religion and new order of social classes. Many millenniums later, we recognize this as all necessary ingredients of a civilization. This is the time when city-states were formed, and Sumerian kings raised armies, established theories of justice and order, and among many other things, invented a form of writing so that knowledge could be passed down from one generation to another in permanent form. Sumerian scribes began to recount the deeds of their kings. In other words, they were beginning to record history. They were the first to write down epic poems and meditations on the meaning of life. About 300 years after the emergence of the Sumerian culture, the civilization began to grow along the banks of some other great rivers such Nile in present-day Egypt, Indus in present-day Pakistan, and the Yellow River in present-day China. Although the magnificent civilizations flourished here, Sumer had been the first. The extraordinary mixture of Sumerian brilliant minds and their land launched new ways of thinking and acting that can be observed in minds, habits, and culture of mankind even nowadays many millenniums later. To this day, we still don't know who the first Sumerians were, or where they came from, and when they arrived to Tigris-Euphrates Valley. There are many guesses and theories, which do not make them necessarily true. One such theory says that they probably originated in a region to the east or northeast of Mesopotamia, because their language was related to one spoken near the Caspian Sea. Many historians are guessing that they arrived in the valley around 8500 BC, when the first primitive agricultural communities were in a process of being established there. The first Sumerians clustered in the far south of the valley, on the swamps that covered much of the delta where Tigris and Euphrates flowed into the Persian Gulf. The early inhabitants quickly learned that winter rain stimulated abundant bloom in the surrounding desert, before the summer Sunday to Friday everything. Along the river banks, the soil was very fertile, deep and rich in minerals washed down from the mountains, where Tigris and Euphrates had their headwaters. Vegetables, barley and wheat grew here easily. Moreover, soil was often enriched by a fresh layer of silt left by spring floods, which made it possible to farm it year after year, generation after generation. The trick was to keep the seedlings thriving through Mesopotamia's dry, hot summers. In the beginning, their first attempts to irrigate their fields were very modest and simple. They carried vessels of water from the rivers to their small plots. Later, the farmers made narrow breaches in the natural levees that had built up over the centuries along the riverbanks, diverting some of the flow. Later on, as their fields moved away from the soft mud of levees to harder ground, the Sumerians invented the plow, which was nothing more than a tree branch. The Sumerians invented later a copper plow, sometime during the course of the 4th millennium. And then, around 3000 BC, they were using a stronger implement, made of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, which made it possible for Sumerians to cultivate much larger plots. The combined efforts of numerous workers and the cooperation of the entire community was required for the construction of networks of canals and dikes. Long before the advancement of irrigation, the traditional labor force among the roaming herders and primitive farmers consisted of family members or clan. However, families and clan alone were not capable to maintain and dig complicated irrigation systems. People were forced to band together. In turn, this produced close communities that grew into towns and cities. As the irrigation was perfected, the Sumerians were pushed toward specialization of new divisions of labor. Managers and experts emerged, men who laid out canals and dikes and ensured the flow of water reached its destination. These experts invented new technology, calculating and surveying the slopes and flow patterns. This directly proves that Sumerians had good mathematical knowledge that was required to make those measurements useful. Their agricultural inventions evoked the Sumerians to pursue the science of astronomy, observing and correlating movements of the sun and the moon and lunar months of 28 days. They were able to quite accurately predict the beginning of the seasons and advised farmers when to plant and harvest their crops. While some experts were preoccupied with farming, others focused on spiritual matters. the Sumerian religion proved to be quite powerful that it endured for 3,000 years, greatly influencing the succession of peoples who occupied Mesopotamia after Sumer's decline. However, aside from irrigation, commerce, government, and religion, one of the most important Sumerian achievements was the invention of writing. Scribes used sharpened reeds to etch marks in small clay tablets. Now, Sumerians could record and keep records of land surveys, civic activities, foodstuffs that had been sent off to a foreign land for barter, and many other events from their daily lives. The early scribes etched on the tablets were pictographic symbols. Later, as the picture signs evolved, this gave rise to Sumerian schools. In turn, education brought many rewards, including a place among the privileged. The newly trained scribes could have their own private practice and charge fees for writing letters and legal agreements for illiterate clients. During the third millennium, three distinct classes emerged in Sumerian cities. At one extreme was the aristocracy, the king and his government officials, the most prominent priests, and the wealthiest merchants and landowners. At the other extreme were the slaves, forced to remain in bondage because of economic or political circumstances. In the middle was the majority of Sumerian population, ordinary free citizens such as farmers, fishermen, artisans, and scribes. Of course, the people at the top lived best. The biggest landowners had estates, sometimes covering hundreds of acres. Like the temples, many of these provincial and royal estates resembled small towns in their complexity. The houses of wealthy Sumerians, whether on estates or in the cities, were comfortable structures that often contained a dozen or more rooms. However, no residence of aristocracy could compare with that of a king. The palaces of rulers became increasingly lavish, rivaling even the towering ziggurats in size and elegance. The palace at Mary was spread out over more than 8 acres and contained almost 300 rooms. During this time, Sumerian communities underwent profound physical changes. Around 3000 BC, less than 20 Sumerian cities had population of several thousand people. 500 years later, the population of entire Sumer exceeded 500,000 people, and it's estimated that 4/5 of the people resided in the cities. The cities became a part of the much large governmental jurisdiction, city-states, which embraced the surrounding agricultural villages that fed them. The first city-state, Uruk, became a prototype or others in the ancient world. In 2700 BC, Uruk included 76 villages. The city itself sprawled on more than 1,000 acres and housed nearly 50,000 people. For protection against enemies, Uruk was surrounded by a wall nearly 10 kilometers long. It was made of burnt bricks, and according to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it glistened in the harsh Sumerian sun with the brilliance of copper. That wall was a sign of the times that warfare had become frequent in Sumer. Part of the reason was geography. Mesopotamia didn't have natural barriers that could protect it from invasion by the barbarous people who surrounded it to the east and west. Additionally, there were disputes between the Sumerian cities. As the cities expanded, the inhabitants quarreled about their common boundaries, and with increasing frequency, about diversion of water from the rivers for irrigation. Every new canal dug upstream lessened the amount of water available to the cities downriver. Considering the importance of irrigation, a dispute about water was often quite literally a matter of life and death. The continuous hostilities shaped the way Sumerians governed themselves. However, even as the people of the valley developed traits as institutions that would constitute their great gift to humanity, they were nurturing seeds of their own destruction. The tragic defect in development of Sumerian civilization was the failure to live in peace, to resolve the bitter disputes between city-states. For the greater part of the third millennium, the plain between the rivers was ravaged by warfare. Instead of being united by a common language and culture, Sumerians hacked at one another with axes and maces, ran one another through with lances, and pierced one another with daggers and arrows. Even at times when Sumer seemed at the pinnacle of its power, the foundations of its civilization were beginning to crumble. Its very underpinning, agriculture, was falling into decline because centuries of irrigation had finally diminished the fertility of the fields, leaving residues of salt as water evaporated. crop production dwindled. Surplus food stocks were expended, and anxiety haunted Sumer. The city-states, their political strength already sapped by a millennium of squabbling and fighting, soon lapsed into the old pattern of warring among themselves. Then came stepped-up pressure from the barbarian tribes that bordered Sumer. About 1950 BC, those old enemies on the east, the Elamites, took advantage of Sumer's weakened state, invading and destroying the city of Ur. They carried its king off into captivity and toppled the dynasty founded by Ur-Nammu a century earlier. Next, from the deserts to the west, appeared a new enemy, the Amorites. Semitic nomads who raised cattle and herded sheep, the Amorites had been peacefully infiltrating Sumer for years, even serving as mercenaries of the various city-states. Now they entered Mesopotamia in even greater numbers, overrunning the cities and eventually establishing their capital in the north at the previously unimportant city of Babylon. There, while Sumerians were engaged in fighting each other farther south, the Amorites founded a dynasty of kings. There was the final nail in the coffin of the Sumerian civilization.